Welcome back to Business Connection. I'm Liz Spencer. Our conversation continues with Katrina Steffes. She's the CEO of Steffes & Associates Language and Translation LLC, also known as SALT. Now, we've been talking a lot about when you need it, how you use it, but tell me a little bit about the translation process. If I have a document, I'm a company, and I am needing some help with my international marketing and business, and I call you, what happens next?
Well, once we receive that document, then we can take a look at it and really delve into it and get an idea of what's going to be needed and ask you questions. This is important. You should be receiving lots of questions at this point. Where is the document going to be used? Not just what country, but specifically inside the country. Which region and area inside the country will it be used? What are your goals? Do you have marketing goals? What is your turnaround time? What are your deadlines? You want the translation to be prepared at XYZ date, but we need to think about all the other little deadlines in between. And if you're going to need, for example, for marketing material, after we translate it, to make changes to the original, then we need to buffer in and add in that extra time to translate what we originally translated to now match those edits. So we pull all of that together, bring up any cultural questions or concerns that we may have, as we touched on earlier, and pull that all together into a quote before we send it back to you, and that's how we get started.
Wow, that's great. And ideally, we should probably think about you pretty soon once we think about that international business, because it's going to, as we're putting our marketing plan together or thinking about a business deal, that the translation and interpretation is huge. Now, we haven't talked a lot about interpretation. Tell me a little bit about that. We all, I think, have an idea of what an interpreter does, but we probably really don't know the full extent. Right,
and so interpretation is that spoken component of the linguistic process. And there's three different main types of interpretation. You have your simultaneous interpretation, where the interpreter is speaking simultaneously at the same time as the speaker. You have your consecutive interpretation, where the interpreter is waiting for the speaker to finish speaking and then is interpreting. And then you have your sight translation, where the interpreter is given a piece of paper or a document with some sort of text on it and is then asked to orally transmit and interpret what is on that document.
Wow.
So you have to first know what type of interpretation do you need.
And I assume that you would coach a little bit, because we may come in thinking we want one and it would be better for something. We may want simultaneous and it might be better.
Exactly. We would, as we sit down and talk about the goals of the project and how much time is involved in the project, and do you need equipment for the project for the simultaneous interpreting. When we talk about all of that, that's where we are able to decide on what route will be best for your company.
I think we always worry a little bit with interpretation in that we don't know what the person's saying. How do you and I would instantly know, because I trust you, to go to you, but how do you build that trust with the interpretation, that you know what you're speaking is being translated?
Sure, exactly. Well, the trust factor is extremely important to start with. You want to make sure that you have certified linguists, if that certification is available, and it's not available in all languages or in all fields, but that's a great starting point. From there, if that certification is not available, make sure that you have an accredited linguist. We use accredited certified linguists, and we verify all of our linguists. This is really important. You want to make sure that you have professionals who are trained in that translation and interpreting, and trained in that specific field of translation and interpreting, to avoid any of those costly mistakes or pitfalls, and so that you then don't have to worry about what's being said and worrying if it's being properly conveyed.
I think you said an important word there that the interpreter needs to be trained in that particular fields. And I often think, you speak Spanish.
Right.
You're a Spanish interpreter, but if you're not part of the medical field, that might be much harder for you.
Completely different vocabulary, from medical to legal to scientific. They all have a different vocabulary and encompass something different. And so that's where we bring in that translator or interpreter who is well-versed in that specific field and knows the ins and outs of your field, to be able to translate that document or interpret that conversation or that facility tour.
And let's use the example of the facility tour. How many interpreters would be needed for something like that? How long do they work? How do you take care of your interpreter so you get the best possible translation?
Well, again, the number of interpreters needed, that will that'll depend on how many people are going to be at this tour. Are we talking a couple people? Are we talking 50 people? Is what's going on before and after the tour. So there's a lot that goes into making this decision. But then you move into, like you said, taking care of your interpreter and how many interpreters are needed then. Well, it's really important to remember that interpreters are people. They're not machines. And so you can't really go past a couple hours before that interpreter is just taxed. And then you're going to need to bring in another interpreter. And every 30 minutes or so, 20, 30 minutes, depending on how quickly the speech is going and what is happening in this context, the interpreter needs a break. The interpreter needs to be able to freshen up, get a glass of water, go to the bathroom, have some time for their brain to process everything that's going on.
Because a good interpreter or translator makes it look easy, but
Yes.
Behind that easy is a lot of work to switch those languages.
Yes, to go back and forth between those languages is very mentally taxing, and you need to be aware of that. Of course, we want to be aware of it for the well-being of the interpreter. We want to watch out for our interpreters and make sure that they're being cared for. And we also want to keep in mind the quality of the service that we're receiving. You know, as a company, you come to SALT, you want to make sure that you're receiving that top-notch quality from start all the way through to the finish, the end of the project. And that's why you would need to bring in another interpreter if you go past that, you know, couple hours, for example. It's time to bring someone else in to make sure that you are receiving the best possible quality in your interpretation.
Right. Well, and if you're making the effort to have interpreters on site for a tour or something like that, it would make sense to do it all the way and to
do it right the first time.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we do with SALT is we offer that technical specialized translation coupled with that cultural coaching to do it right the first time, get that translation and that interpretation right the first time, make that amazing impression on your customer, retain them, bring them back for more. And that's what we're here for.
That's awesome. Thank you for stopping by and sharing with us what you do and all your knowledge.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. We'll be right back with more Business Connections. Stay tuned.